spies, Joshua. And Joshua succeeds Moses as Moses dies. Before Moses dies, in the book of Deuteronomy, we get a summary of his last great sermon and teaching. And in that great sermon and teaching in Deuteronomy, we hear what is called the Great Commandment. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God. God gives his people the command to worship and obey him. And in Deuteronomy also, Moses quotes God and reminds us that God says, let your past be a lesson to you. Remember how I have treated you in the past, how faithful I have been, how loving and caring I have been, how I delivered you from the hands of Pharaoh, how I have brought you safely to this place. Let that be the lesson and the promise for tomorrow. The question for us today as we wrap up our time together is, what does this part of the Bible story mean to us today? We talked about what creation and the fall meant. We talked about what God's choosing a people meant. Now, what does slavery and God's institution of his law mean to us? I think the simplest way to make an answer to that question, we could do many things, but one very simple way is to say to ourselves, what do we learn from this sequence of events about God? What do we learn about God's character? Who is God in this story, in these stories, these episodes? What does God command in these episodes? And what does God promise? I suggest to you 2 or 3 things, and then I'll ask your facilitator to take some time and get some ideas from you. But let me offer a couple of answers to that question. First of all, I think we learn that God tells the truth. That's one thing we learn. God tells his people what he's going to do, and time and again in this series of episodes, we see God doing exactly what he says he's going to do. Secondly, we see God calling people to take particular parts in the story of his working out his relationship with humanity. God could have simply done all of the delivery by himself, but he calls Moses and gives Moses an assignment, as he does Aaron and Miriam and a number of other characters in the story. Thirdly, and let me just suggest this, God then also provides what we need. God gives his people food, water, deliverance, a leader, another leader when his first leader dies. So we see all of those things. I'm wondering now if you, with the help of your facilitator, would offer other answers to the question, what do we learn about God from these episodes about the slavery and law that God gives? The second aspect of answering the question, what does this Bible episode mean to us, is what do we learn about ourselves? We learn some things about God every time we read the Bible. We learn about God's character, we learn about his commands, we learn about God's promises and assurances. But we also learn about ourselves as human beings. What do we learn as we look at characters like Moses, Miriam, the Hebrew people as a group, Pharaoh, the Israelites, the brothers of Joseph, Aaron, Joshua, Caleb, the other spies, all of the human beings who are integral parts of these stories? First of all, I would suggest to you that we learn that human beings are fickle. We are not particularly faithful. Even when God has done wonderful things for us, we tend to forget. And that's one thing we learn. Secondly, I would suggest to you that we are never satisfied. We have the best, we want something more. God moves us into a future of promise, and we yearn for a past of slavery. A third suggestion I would make before we break and you and your facilitator come up with some other answers to the question, a third suggestion I would make is that we need God. No one in this story does what he or she does without the help and direction of God, without God's call, without God's power and promise. Take some time now with your facilitator and offer other answers to the question, what do we learn about ourselves from the story of the slavery of God's people and God's law? Thank you for joining me for this session of the Bible, His Story. As we look toward the next session entitled Judges and Kings, we will be talking about what happens when God's chosen people finally come in and inhabit the land He promised all those years ago to Abraham. In the meantime, go in peace to love and serve the Lord.